Welcome to Gospel Commission. My name is Christopher. Today we're going to take a quick dive into Romans chapter 5, verse 12 through 14. I've got a longer form video of this I'm going to put out on the same day if you want to go more in depth into the passage. But this I want to just take a quick look at because it's related to the doctrine of total depravity and is often used as a proof text that we are born with a sinful nature and that we are born totally depraved and cannot follow God without first being regenerated and born again. This is a doctrine that was created by Augustine in the 5th century. It's an unorthodox teaching. It was a new doctrine at the time, not according to the early church writings and beliefs, but was something new. So we want to jump in here and look at what this passage is supposed to say to us according to the Calvinists and those that hold to total depravity and what it actually says. Verse 12 is the key verse here. Therefore, as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death has spread to all men because all have sinned. Now, what we're supposed to read in this passage in the last phrase is because all have sinned in Adam. In other words, when Adam sinned, we all sinned, and therefore we're all guilty of what Adam did. And that's why in Augustine's theory and doctrine, not only were we born corrupt, we were also born guilty before God, already condemned to hell, which is why he argued that babies should be baptized, because it washes away original sin. It washes away the guilt that we are born with. And so here they want to add, because all have sinned in Adam. Another thing that is often used is they'll say that this because, if you look in the Greek, is supposed to be for that. For that. So some of the older versions, for example, the American Standard Version, also the King James Version, say, for that all have sinned. To that, let me first just say, for that is an old way to say because. So either way, whether it's for that or because, all of it just means because all have sinned. And here we don't see that there's any added idea that says we have all sinned in Adam. So this is just adding into the passage. We also want to note that in this verse, it starts with therefore. Therefore means that he's going to talk about what has already come before and add something to our understanding of that passage. Now, in Romans chapter 1 through 3, he was talking about the sinfulness of the Gentiles and then also the sinfulness of the Jew and the Jews, that they were all guilty before God because they have all rebelled against either the law or against the light that God had given them to know that he was the creator of heaven and earth. We see that in Romans 1:18. So then it goes on from chapter 3 through 5, and it's talking about the issue of being justified by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, not through the works of the law of Moses. And so he's coming up. He has just talked about in chapter 5, verse 6 through 8, he talked about that Jesus Christ, one man, died for the ungodly. He died for wicked men so that we could be saved. And then he comes up here in verse 12 and says, therefore, as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, so death has spread to all men because all have sinned. Let's pay attention here to these two words, as and so. Now, so therefore, as sin and so death, what we see here is a very clear teaching from Paul. He's going to reiterate what he has been saying up to this point. He doesn't say anything new. He doesn't say anything unique. He doesn't bring in a whole new doctrine or a whole new understanding. At this point, all he's saying is exactly the same thing he's been saying. He says this, therefore, as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin. In other words, one man was the first Adam, sinned against God, and because of that, death also entered the world. So sin came in through one man, and then death followed that sin. So as death came into the world through one man, so death has spread to all men because all have sinned. So there's a parallel. In the same way that Adam sinned and then brought forth death, in the same way, all men have sinned, and therefore all men are under the penalty of death. This is completely in line with what he's been saying up to this point. That's why he says, therefore. He's saying that because the Gentiles sinned against the law, against the knowledge of God and worshipped idols, they were handed over to debased desires. In the same way, the Jews had rebelled against the knowledge that they received in the law, and because of that, they were counted hypocrites, and they were also guilty before God. So all men were guilty, as it said in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And this is all he is repeating here. He's just adding to the fact that it entered through one man, and then we also sinned and also received the death penalty. He goes on in verse 13, and in the first sentence, he continues not to say anything new at all. He said, "For until the law, sin was in the world." So in other words, before the law of Moses came, Cain killed his brother and was held accountable for it. The ground was no longer going to bring forth fruit for him. He was cast out of all human society and had to create a parallel society for himself because he could not live among men. And God put a mark on him so that he would not be killed by other people, but he was not able to till the ground any longer. God held him accountable for his sin because sin was in the world before the law. Then he goes on, if we go on in the history, in Genesis chapter 6, God killed the whole world with a flood because the wickedness of man was great. We can move on to the Tower of Babel. God separated the nations because of their wickedness and their pride, desiring to make a great name for themselves. So we see that up to this point, 12 and 13a, Paul is not saying anything strange. He's saying that Adam sinned, and because of that came death. Everybody else also sinned, and because of that, death, because Romans 6:23 says the wages of sin is death. And then in verse 13 it says, "For until the law, sin was in the world." We can look at the history of the Old Testament and we see very clearly that there was indeed sin in the world and God held men accountable for it. But, now he adds the word but, which means he's going to switch the thought. He's going to add something here. Now what he's about to do, if you flip over to Hebrews chapter 7, you will see that the writer of Hebrews, he wrote in such a way as to talk about the Old Testament Melchizedek. There was a man in the Old Testament that met Abraham, Melchizedek, and he uses this man as a type. He says, we don't know his parents, we don't know of his lineage, and we don't know about his death, and so he compares him to Christ, who has no beginning and no end. He goes on and says, Abraham paid tithes to this man, so this man is greater than Abraham, and Abraham gave birth to the Levites who received tithe under the law of Moses. Therefore, the Levites paid tithes to Melchizedek in Adam when he paid tithes. So when you look at that passage, if you go over there to Hebrews 7, I'll let you look through it, you'll see that the way that the Old Testament passage is used, it's stretched very, very far. In fact, if we do look just at one verse here in verse 9, Hebrews 7, verse 9, the writer says it this way, "One might say that Levi also, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met Abraham." So he says, one might say. In other words, he's going to stretch an analogy in order to compare Melchizedek and Christ. This is what Paul is about to do the same way here in Romans chapter 5. Now to be clear, Romans chapter 5 verse 12 and 13a thus far only confirm that all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory, and that the wages of sin is death for our sin, and that sin was in the world until the law, and God held men accountable for it. But, he says in the second sentence, but sin is not counted when there is no law. So he's going to introduce this concept. In 1 John chapter 3, we read that sin, or it might be chapter 2, it says that sin is transgression of the law, and sin is lawlessness. So transgressing the law is sin under a strict definition. And Adam was given a law not to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. So he broke a law. He transgressed God's law. He trespassed against the law of God. But here he makes this statement in verse 13, but sin is not counted when there is no law. First of all, let me ask, is that totally true? No, we've already looked at the Old Testament passages. We know that when before the law came, God held men accountable for their sin. They were counted as sinners for their specific sins. But verse 14, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of Adam's sin. So what was Adam's sin? He disobeyed a direct command of God. Cain was, we don't know of him being told, do not murder your brother. It was probably unnecessary to tell him such a thing. When we go to Genesis chapter 6 or Genesis chapter 11, we don't see that there was any laws that they were breaking that were given as a strict law from God. And so those people did not disobey. They sinned against God, but not in the exact same way that Moses had sinned against a God by disobeying a given command. So he says, but nevertheless, from Adam until Moses, everybody died. So what's he trying to say here? They didn't sin in the same way Adam did. They weren't commanded, don't eat of this tree, and if you do, you will die. Nevertheless, they died. Now, why did they die? They all died because they were separated from the tree of life. Adam got kicked out of the garden, and we were all born outside of the garden. So strictly speaking, logically speaking, we all died because we, as a human race, we were separated from the tree of life. We were no longer born with immortality or access to the tree of life to gain immortality, but we were born dead. We were born separated from life, only condemned to die. So in the same way, Adam sinned, and he was cast out of the garden, and we face the consequence of that sin. We also are born without access to life. So why did they die? Why did Cain, why did the generation in Genesis 6 or the generation in the time of Babel in Genesis 11, why did they die? We read up in verse 12 and 13a, they died because of their sin, because they sinned against God. They were guilty and held accountable. But in another sense, it's as if Paul is saying this, but one could say that they died because of Adam's sin, that it was what Adam did that caused all men to die. Not what they did, but it was his sin that led to the consequence that we were all born in death. Now, why does he say this? Why does he switch things and look at things from a different angle? It tells us, who was a type of him who was to come. So Paul's goal here is to make a connection between Adam and Jesus. In other words, what Adam did brought consequences on people after Adam. And what Jesus does brings consequences on what happens after people, those that trust in Christ. So whenever we go through the rest of the passage, we're not going to do that here. I went through it a little bit more in the longer form video. But in this passage here, it goes on and it begins to show the difference between Adam and Moses. How Adam brought death, Jesus brings life. How Adam, in verse 16, we see the gift is not like the result that came through the one who sinned, for the judgment from one sin to the condemnation, but the free gift which came after many trespasses led to justification. So here he says that there was many sins against God, and Jesus' one death brought life in that, whereas before it was one sin that brought death for many people. So as you go through the rest of the passage, you'll be able to see that he's making that connection, and he ends in verse 20 and 21 talking about the law, because this is actually what he's bringing up. He's bringing up the fact that the law brings knowledge of sin and makes sin utterly sinful, as we'll see in Romans chapter 7 when he brings back up this thought. But focused here on verse 12, therefore, as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, so death is spread to all men because all have sinned. Same way, one man sinned and it brought death. In the same way, all men sinned and all men died. Verse 13, why is this so? For until the law, sin was in the world. There was sin, there was responsibility, and there was consequences for sin. But sin is not counted when there is no law, so we could look at it in another way. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of Adam's transgression. It was only Adam that transgressed the law, which had the penalty of death with it. The day you eat of this fruit, you will die. He was cast out of the garden, and all of his descendants were born outside of the garden, away from the tree of life. They were born mortal, without access to immortality. Who was a type of him who was to come? He makes this connection. He looks at it in this way so that he can see, so that he can then compare Adam and Jesus and show how they're different and yet the same in some ways. I hope this has been helpful to you. The doctrine of total depravity, original sin, being born with a sinful nature because our parents passed on sinfulness in the act of sexual intercourse which filled with lust, and the baby is conceived in lust. This is all made up by Augustine. This is not true. We are born in such a way that we can still respond to the grace of God when he comes to us. We can repent and believe. That's why we're held accountable for not repenting and not believing. And we'll be judged on the day of judgment because we do have choice and we are responsible. Hope this is helpful to you. God bless.